"You tore the wrong woman's dress," the old maitre d' whispered under his breath, though no one around him seemed to hear. The sentence vanished beneath the soft piano music and the gentle clinking of crystal glasses inside the Grand Astoria Ballroom in Manhattan, where the city's most influential executives had gathered beneath towering chandeliers for the annual Hawthorne Foundation Gala. Everything about the evening reflected wealth measured in private jets, penthouses overlooking Central Park, and billion-dollar mergers casually discussed over perfectly plated filet mignon. At the center of the room stood Ethan Callaway, 38 years old, founder and CEO of Callaway Dynamics, the kind of man whose signature could move stock prices before breakfast. His tailored tuxedo fit with mathematical precision. His confidence filled every corner of the ballroom, and his reputation for demanding perfection had become almost legendary among employees, investors, and competitors alike. Across the polished marble floor moved Naomi Brooks, a 26-year-old black waitress whose pressed uniform, quiet posture, and steady hands made her nearly invisible to the guests she served. She carried silver trays with practiced grace, never interrupting conversations, never asking for attention, and never revealing the quiet resilience hidden behind her calm expression. Most people saw only another waitress working another luxury event. None of them noticed the small silver pendant tucked beneath the collar of her uniform or the way her eyes instinctively scanned every entrance before returning to work. She had mastered the art of blending into expensive rooms without ever belonging to them. That talent had kept her safe for years. Until tonight. It happened in less than 3 seconds. A server from another section accidentally brushed against Naomi while weaving between crowded tables. The movement shifted her balance just enough for a single splash of sparkling water to land on the sleeve of Ethan's jacket. The room inhaled at once. Naomi immediately reached for a clean linen napkin, her voice calm and respectful. "I'm so sorry, sir." Ethan looked down at the damp fabric, as though someone had insulted his entire empire. Before anyone could react, he grabbed the edge of the lightweight outer layer she wore over her uniform and jerked it away in a sharp, careless motion, tearing the inexpensive fabric with a loud rip that echoed far louder than it should have inside the suddenly silent ballroom. It was not an act that caused physical harm, but it left the room frozen in stunned disbelief. Conversation stopped. Violin strings seemed to disappear into the silence. Dozens of smartphones quietly tilted upward beneath elegant dinner tables. Naomi stood perfectly still, clutching the remaining fabric without anger, without panic, and without a single tear. She simply lifted her chin and met Ethan's eyes with a calmness that felt almost impossible. Ethan mistook that silence for defeat. He had no idea it was restraint, because while every guest believed they had just witnessed the end of an ordinary waitress's dignity, somewhere beyond the glowing city skyline, a convoy of black SUVs was already moving toward the hotel. Inside the lead vehicle sat a man whose organization reached far beyond boardrooms and balance sheets. A man who had spent 7 relentless years searching every major city in America for one missing young woman. He carried only one faded photograph. The woman in that picture was standing only a few hundred feet away, wearing a torn uniform, surrounded by people who still believed they understood who she was. The silence lasted only a few seconds before the ballroom remembered how to breathe, yet nothing truly returned to normal. Forks remained suspended above porcelain plates. Conversations restarted in cautious whispers. A string quartet continued playing near the grand staircase, but every polished note seemed strangely distant beneath the weight of what everyone had just witnessed. Naomi Brooks quietly gathered the torn outer layer of her uniform without rushing, folded it with careful hands, and placed it on her serving tray beside the untouched linen napkin. She did not argue. She did not demand an apology. She simply thanked another server who offered her a replacement jacket and gently declined with a smile that puzzled everyone who saw it. Ethan Callaway adjusted the cuff of his jacket as though the evening had merely suffered a minor inconvenience. To him, control meant never appearing shaken, and admitting regret in public was a language he had never learned. Several investors laughed politely, eager to remain on the winning side of the room, while others exchanged uneasy glances that said far more than their words ever could. Grace Turner, the restaurant manager, hurried toward Naomi with visible concern hidden beneath professional composure. She lowered her voice and asked whether she wanted to step away from the ballroom for a few minutes. Naomi looked toward the glittering windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline before answering with quiet certainty. "The guests are still waiting to be served." Grace studied her face, expecting anger or embarrassment, but found neither. There was only remarkable steadiness, the kind that came from someone who had survived storms much greater than a difficult evening. As Naomi returned to her duties, several guests found themselves watching her instead of the celebrity speakers preparing to begin the charity presentation. They noticed details they had ignored earlier. She greeted every table with the same calm respect. She remembered names without checking place cards. She anticipated requests before anyone spoke. Even after what had happened, not a single movement betrayed resentment. It was dignity in its purest form, and somehow it unsettled the room more than outrage would have. Across the ballroom, Ethan accepted congratulations from business partners discussing an acquisition rumored to exceed $4 billion. He smiled confidently, convinced the uncomfortable moment had already faded into the background. What he did not notice was the growing number of discrete phone screens displaying the same short video recorded only moments earlier. No dramatic captions. No exaggerated commentary. Just a few silent seconds that allowed viewers to reach their own conclusions. Meanwhile, nearly 15 miles away, the convoy moved steadily through late evening traffic. Rain from an earlier shower still reflected the city. Lights across the pavement as identical black sport utility vehicles crossed the Queensboro Bridge without attracting unnecessary attention. Inside the lead vehicle, Vincent Moretti held the weathered photograph between his fingers once again. The picture had softened with age after years of being unfolded, studied, and carefully protected. A younger Naomi smiled into the camera beside an elderly woman standing outside a neighborhood church during a summer community festival. The image had become more than evidence. It had become a promise. Vincent's longtime advisor glanced at a secure tablet before speaking quietly. The facial recognition confirmation just came through. 99.8% probability. She is at the Grand Astoria. Vincent closed his eyes for a brief moment before opening them with calm determination. "After 7 years," he said softly, "let us make certain no one else decides her worth before learning her name." Long before anyone in the Grand Astoria ballroom learned her name, Naomi Brooks had already mastered the difficult art of disappearing in plain sight. Every morning began before sunrise inside a modest apartment in Queens where the sounds of passing subway trains blended with the first light filtering through old brick buildings. Her life followed a routine built on discipline rather than comfort. She brewed a simple cup of coffee, reviewed the schedule for her hospitality classes at a local community college, and carefully tucked the small silver pendant beneath the collar of whatever uniform she would wear that day. The necklace never left her. Few people asked about it, and when they did, she answered with the same quiet smile and a gentle change of subject. The truth remained locked behind years of silence. Naomi had learned that some questions were safer left unanswered. Her co-workers knew her as dependable, thoughtful, and almost impossible to provoke. If another server arrived late, Naomi covered the shift without complaint. If a guest spoke harshly, she answered with kindness instead of pride. Grace Turner often wondered how someone so young carried herself with the patience of a person twice her age. She never realized that resilience had become Naomi's closest companion long before she ever stepped into a luxury hotel. 7 years earlier, everything connected to her past had vanished almost overnight. Friends disappeared. Familiar places were abandoned. Even her last name changed. Since then, every new city had become another opportunity to remain unnoticed. She accepted that anonymity was the price of peace. Yet despite living carefully, she refused to let fear define her character. She volunteered on weekends at a neighborhood food pantry, quietly donated part of every paycheck to a scholarship fund for children in her old church, and always remembered the birthdays of coworkers whose own families lived hundreds of miles away. Kindness had become her way of resisting a world that often rewarded arrogance. Back inside the ballroom, the charity program finally began beneath brilliant crystal chandeliers as distinguished guests applauded polished speeches celebrating leadership, generosity, and integrity. The words echoed beautifully through the room, yet several audience members found themselves distracted by the memory of what had happened only minutes before. Ethan Callaway remained seated at the head table, speaking confidently with investors about expansion plans into international markets. His voice carried certainty, but he sensed subtle changes in the atmosphere surrounding him. Conversations ended when he approached. Smiles appeared slower than usual. A few longtime partners avoided direct eye contact altogether. He dismissed it as temporary discomfort, believing success always outweighed perception. Across the room, Naomi continued serving coffee with the same steady hands that had carried hundreds of trays before tonight. As she approached a table near the ballroom entrance, an elderly guest quietly stopped her. Without introducing himself, he simply looked at the torn edge of her uniform and said, "The strongest people are usually the ones who never announce their strength." Naomi thanked him softly and continued walking, unaware that outside the hotel revolving doors, the convoy had finally arrived. The engines fell silent one after another beneath the glowing lights of Fifth Avenue. Hotel attendants instinctively stepped aside as sharply dressed security professionals exited the vehicles with calm precision. Vincent Moretti remained seated for one final moment, looking once more at the faded photograph before slipping it carefully into the inside pocket of his coat. After 7 years of searching across countless cities, every unanswered question, every exhausted lead, and every quiet promise had brought him to this single address, with a woman the world believed was only another waitress continued serving strangers with grace, never imagining that her hidden past was only moments away from walking through the front door. The revolving doors turned almost silently, yet something about the atmosphere shifted before anyone inside understood why. Hotel staff who had welcomed governors, celebrities, and international executives throughout the evening instinctively straightened their posture as several impeccably dressed men entered the marble lobby with quiet confidence. They did not raise their voices. They did not rush. Their composure alone drew curious glances from guests lingering near the ballroom entrance. At their center walked Vincent Moretti, a distinguished man in his late 50s whose silver hair and tailored charcoal overcoat reflected neither extravagance nor vanity, only discipline earned through decades of responsibility. His expression remained calm, but his eyes searched every face with remarkable focus. The concierge greeted him by name, surprising several employees who had never expected such a reserved visitor to command immediate recognition. Vincent acknowledged the greeting with a polite nod before asking only one question. "Is the charity gala still in progress?" The concierge answered yes and offered to escort him inside. Vincent declined with a quiet smile. "I know exactly where I need to go." Meanwhile, inside the ballroom, Ethan Callaway stepped onto the stage to introduce the foundation's newest innovation initiative. Applause rolled through the room as enormous screens displayed images celebrating leadership, ambition, and opportunity. Ethan spoke with the confidence of a man, accustomed to commanding every audience. He described growth, vision, and the importance of creating a better future through technology. The speech was polished, persuasive, and carefully rehearsed. Yet beneath the applause, an unusual distraction continued spreading through the ballroom. More guests glanced toward their phones than toward the presentation itself. The brief recording from earlier had quietly circulated among attendees, and although no one confronted Ethan directly, the mood surrounding him had become noticeably restrained. Naomi Brooks remained focused on her work, carefully refilling water glasses along the outer tables while avoiding unnecessary attention. She had experienced uncomfortable moments before, and she believed the fastest way to move beyond them was to continue doing her job with dignity. As she reached the final table near the ballroom entrance, a young employee from the front desk hurried toward Grace Turner and whispered something into her ear. Grace's expression changed immediately. She looked toward the lobby, then toward Naomi, then back again, clearly uncertain how to respond. Before she could move, the ballroom doors opened once more. Conversation slowed. Camera flashes from photographers briefly illuminated the entrance as Vincent Moretti stepped inside, surrounded by only 2 associates, leaving the rest of his security team outside. He ignored the stage, the celebrities, and the executives who quietly recognized him. His attention remained fixed on one person alone. Naomi felt the unusual silence before she saw its cause. She turned slowly, expecting another guest requesting service. Instead, she found herself looking into the eyes of a man she did not recognize, but who seemed to recognize her completely. Vincent stopped several feet away, his expression softening with unmistakable relief. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The entire ballroom appeared suspended between curiosity and confusion. Ethan paused in the middle of his presentation, noticing that every face in the audience had shifted away from the stage. Vincent reached inside his coat, removed the faded photograph that had traveled with him for 7 years, and compared it carefully to the young woman standing before him. A gentle smile crossed his face as though an impossible search had finally reached its end. Then, in a voice calm enough for the silent ballroom to hear every word, he said, "Miss Naomi Brooks, I have been hoping this day would come for a very long time." Naomi stared at the faded photograph in Vincent Moretti's hand as though it belonged to another lifetime. Her steady expression finally softened, not with fear, but with quiet disbelief. The image showed a younger version of herself standing beside the elderly woman who had raised her after tragedy had reshaped her childhood. The summer sunlight in the picture felt impossibly distant from the brilliant chandeliers above the ballroom. For several long seconds, she could not find the words to answer. Around them, hundreds of guests watched in complete silence, sensing they had become witnesses to something far greater than another glamorous charity gala. Ethan Calloway stepped away from the podium, forcing a polite smile as he approached the unexpected visitors. Years of leading negotiations had taught him to recover quickly from uncomfortable surprises. "Good evening," he said confidently. "I'm Ethan Calloway. Welcome to our event." Vincent acknowledged him with a brief nod, but did not extend his hand. His attention remained entirely on Naomi. "Miss Brooks," he said gently, "you may not remember me, but I promised someone very important that I would never stop searching until I found you." Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment as memories she had carefully buried began returning one by one. She remembered hurried departures before sunrise, new names on official documents, different schools, different cities, adults speaking in whispers whenever they thought she was asleep. She had spent years believing those chapters of her life had been permanently closed. Grace Turner stepped closer, uncertain whether Naomi needed support or privacy. Before she could speak, Vincent carefully unfolded a second document from inside a leather portfolio. It was not a legal demand or a business contract. It was a worn handwritten letter protected inside a transparent sleeve. The paper had yellowed with age, but the careful handwriting remained perfectly preserved. Vincent held it respectfully instead of dramatically. "This was entrusted to me 7 years ago," he explained. "I was instructed to deliver it only when I found you, and only when I knew you were finally safe." Naomi's breathing slowed as she recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to the woman who had raised her with kindness, humility, and unwavering faith. Tears gathered in her eyes for the first time that evening, but they never fell. Across the ballroom, whispers spread from table to table. Investors who had ignored Naomi less than an hour earlier now watched with growing curiosity. Several guests quietly searched Vincent Moretti's name on their phones, discovering stories of a respected businessman known not only for extraordinary influence, but also for decades of charitable work, scholarship foundations, and unwavering loyalty to promises he considered sacred. Ethan noticed the shifting mood with increasing discomfort. He had expected the evening to revolve around his keynote address and the foundation's achievements. Instead, every conversation now centered on the quiet waitress standing beside a man whose arrival had changed the emotional gravity of the room without raising his voice once. Vincent finally looked directly at Ethan with calm professionalism. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "before I speak with Miss Brooks in private, there is one question I would appreciate your help answering." Ethan straightened confidently. "Of course." Vincent glanced briefly at the torn edge of Naomi's uniform, then returned his eyes to the billionaire. His voice remained courteous, but every word carried unmistakable weight. "Would you kindly explain how the remarkable young woman I have searched for across this country was treated this evening while standing under your roof?" The question lingered in the air with a quiet authority that no one dared interrupt. Ethan Calloway had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions, testified before congressional committees, and faced aggressive investors without losing his composure. Yet, for the first time in years, he found himself searching for an answer that sounded reasonable even to his own ears. He glanced briefly toward Naomi before responding in a measured tone that had built his reputation. "There was an unfortunate misunderstanding during the event," he said. "It was never my intention to disrespect anyone." Vincent Moretti listened without changing his expression. He neither challenged the explanation nor accepted it. Instead, he turned toward Grace Turner. "Were you here when it happened?" Grace hesitated only a moment. Her loyalty to the hotel mattered, but her integrity mattered more. "Yes," she answered honestly. Miss Brooks accepted responsibility for an accident that was not entirely her fault. She apologized immediately and remained professional throughout the evening. Vincent nodded appreciatively before shifting his attention to several nearby guests. Without asking directly, he noticed enough faces quietly lowering their eyes to understand that many of them had witnessed the same moment. Truth rarely required dramatic speeches when silence itself confirmed it. Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm and respectful. "Mr. Moretti, I do not want a night to become about me. The event was organized to raise money for families who need help. Please do not let this overshadow their purpose." Her words surprised everyone in the ballroom. She had every opportunity to encourage public embarrassment, yet she chose restraint instead. Vincent looked at her with unmistakable admiration. "That is exactly why I was determined to find you," he said softly. Character reveals itself most clearly when someone has every reason to seek revenge, but refuses. Ethan heard those words more sharply than any public criticism. He studied Naomi with new attention, noticing details he had overlooked earlier. She had never raised her voice. She had never attempted to gain sympathy. Even after being treated unfairly, she continued serving guests with dignity instead of resentment. The realization unsettled him in ways financial losses never could. One of Vincent's associates quietly approached and handed him a tablet displaying a secure document. Vincent reviewed it for only a few seconds before returning his attention to Naomi. "Your guardian believed that one day you should decide your own future," he explained. "She entrusted our foundation with resources intended to remain untouched until we located you. Every scholarship, every educational fund, every investment established in your name has been carefully protected for 7 years." A wave of astonishment swept through the ballroom. Naomi blinked in disbelief. "My name?" she asked almost in a whisper. Vincent smiled warmly. "You were never forgotten. While you were building a life through hard work and humility, others were quietly honoring a promise made to your family." Grace covered her mouth in surprise. Several guests exchanged stunned glances as they realized the quiet waitress they had barely noticed possessed a story none of them could have imagined. Ethan slowly looked toward the torn edge of Naomi's uniform once more. For the first time that evening, he no longer saw damaged fabric. He saw a painful reminder of a decision made in arrogance. Outside the ballroom windows, the lights of Manhattan continued shining across the skyline as though nothing had changed. Inside, however, the balance of the room had shifted completely. Wealth, influence, and public status no longer commanded the greatest respect. Quiet dignity did. No one spoke for several long moments, because there was nothing left to say that could compete with the truth quietly unfolding before them. The applause that had filled the ballroom earlier in the evening had vanished, replaced by a silence that demanded reflection rather than celebration. Ethan Calloway slowly stepped away from the stage and walked toward Naomi with none of the confidence that had carried him through countless board meetings. For the first time that night, he looked directly at her instead of through her. He noticed the calm steadiness in her eyes, the careful way she still held the serving tray despite everything that had happened, and the remarkable absence of resentment on her face. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly, "I judged you without knowing anything about you." His words were sincere, yet he understood they could never erase what had already happened. Naomi answered with the same composed voice that had carried her through the entire evening. Most people do not hurt others because they know the truth. They hurt them because they believe appearances tell the whole story. Several guests lowered their eyes after hearing those words. They realized they had witnessed the incident without stepping forward. Some had looked away. Others had chosen silence because speaking against power often carried a personal cost. Vincent Moretti slowly folded the letter and returned it to its protective sleeve before addressing the room. 7 years ago, he said, I gave my word to a remarkable woman that I would protect the future of a young lady she loved like a daughter. She never asked me to build wealth. She never asked me to seek influence. She asked me to make certain that wherever Naomi's journey led, she would always have the freedom to choose her own life when the time came. His voice remained calm, but every sentence carried the weight of a promise faithfully honored. That day has finally arrived. One of Vincent's associates quietly presented Naomi with a small leather portfolio. Inside were official documents confirming educational trusts, investment accounts, and charitable programs that had been preserved in her name for years. Naomi looked at the pages without excitement or disbelief. Instead, she closed the portfolio gently and handed it back. "Please keep everything exactly where it is for now," she said. Vincent looked surprised. "You are not even going to review it." Naomi smiled softly. "I have lived without knowing any of it existed for 7 years. I can wait one more day. Tonight, there are people here who came to support families facing difficult circumstances. They deserve the attention more than I do." A quiet murmur spread across the ballroom. Grace Turner felt tears forming as she watched the young woman everyone had overlooked refuse to let unexpected fortune change her character. Ethan stood motionless, realizing that the greatest difference between success and significance was not measured in dollars, but in humility. The room that had admired power only an hour earlier now admired grace instead. Vincent nodded with unmistakable respect. "Your guardian believed your greatest inheritance would never be money," he said. "She believed it would be your heart. Tonight you have proven she was right." Around the ballroom, guests slowly began to applaud, not because anyone had instructed them to, but because genuine character had accomplished what wealth, prestige, and influence never could. The sound grew stronger with each passing second until the entire room stood together, honoring not a title, not a fortune, but a woman who had answered humiliation with dignity and transformed an evening of embarrassment into a lesson no one present would ever forget. When the applause gradually faded, the ballroom felt different, as though every person inside had entered the evening believing success was measured by influence and was now leaving with an entirely different definition. Conversations resumed, but they carried a quieter tone. Investors who had once competed for Ethan Calloway's attention now found themselves discussing Naomi Brooks instead, not because of the unexpected resources waiting in her name, but because of the extraordinary composure she had displayed when dignity would have been easier to abandon. Ethan stepped away from the crowd and walked toward one of the tall windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Below, streams of headlights flowed through the city with perfect indifference, reminding him that the world never paused for anyone's pride. His phone vibrated several times in quick succession. Messages from board members, senior executives, and longtime advisors filled the screen. None of them mentioned quarterly earnings or acquisition targets. Every message referred to the same short video already spreading across social media. The recording did not exaggerate events. It contained no dramatic music, no edited captions, and no commentary. It simply showed a powerful executive reacting without grace and a young waitress responding with remarkable self-control. Public opinion had reached its own conclusion. Ethan slowly locked his phone and slipped it back into his pocket. For the first time in many years, he realized that reputation could not always be repaired with strategic statements or expensive consultants. Character had to speak before public relations ever could. Nearby, Vincent Moretti quietly approached him without hostility. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "life has a curious way of presenting lessons at the exact moment we believe we no longer need them." Ethan gave a small, thoughtful nod. "I spent years believing respect followed success," he admitted. "Tonight, I discovered success means very little without respect." Vincent offered no lecture. He simply replied, "Then perhaps this evening has already accomplished something valuable." Across the ballroom, Naomi thanked co-workers who embraced her with genuine affection. Grace Turner insisted she take the remainder of the evening off, but Naomi smiled warmly and shook her head. "There's still tables waiting to be cleared," she said. "The event is not over yet." Grace laughed softly through tears. "You really are impossible," Naomi answered with quiet humor. "My grandmother used to say that finishing what you started is another way of honoring the people who believed in you." Together, they began gathering empty glasses while guests respectfully moved aside to make room for them. Several attendees quietly thanked Naomi as she passed. Others apologized for remaining silent earlier. She accepted every apology with kindness, never asking anyone to explain themselves. She understood that changing hearts often mattered more than winning arguments. Before leaving the ballroom, Vincent addressed the event organizers one final time. He announced that his foundation would match every dollar raised during the gala, doubling the support available to the families the charity served. The announcement filled the room with renewed applause, yet Vincent intentionally directed every expression of gratitude toward the volunteers and staff who had worked behind the scenes all evening. As guests prepared to depart beneath the glittering chandeliers, Ethan watched Naomi continue helping others with the same quiet dedication she had shown before anyone knew her story. In that moment, he understood the greatest loss he had suffered. That evening was not public embarrassment, temporary criticism, or uncertain business relationships. It was the painful realization that he had almost overlooked the rarest kind of strength simply because it arrived wearing an ordinary uniform instead of an expensive suit. The final guest slowly drifted toward the hotel entrance beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers, carrying with them a story none of them had expected to witness when the evening began. Outside, the cool Manhattan air welcomed them back to a city that never stopped moving. Yet inside the Grand Astoria ballroom, the lessons of the night lingered long after the music had faded. Naomi Brooks carefully placed the last polished glass onto a service card and quietly thanked every co-worker who had stood beside her throughout the evening. She accepted their hugs, their smiles, and their heartfelt congratulations with the same humility that had defined every moment of her journey. Nothing about her posture suggested that her life had suddenly changed. She still thanked the kitchen staff before leaving. She still folded her apron with care. She still smiled at the hotel doorman as she walked toward the lobby. Vincent Moretti waited nearby without rushing her. For 7 years, he had honored a promise through patience, and he understood that some chapters deserved to close gently rather than dramatically. As they prepared to leave together, he handed Naomi the handwritten letter one final time. "It belongs with you now," he said. Naomi held it close to her heart before looking toward the ballroom one last time. "I think she always knew this day would come," she whispered. Vincent smiled. She believed that no matter where life took you, kindness would always lead you home. Across the lobby, Ethan Calloway approached them without cameras, without advisors, and without the confidence that had surrounded him earlier that evening. He stood quietly before Naomi, knowing there were no carefully chosen words capable of undoing what had already happened. "Miss Brooks," he said sincerely, I cannot change my actions, but I can choose what I become after tonight. I am truly sorry. Naomi studied his face for a brief moment before offering a gentle nod. An apology matters most when it becomes a different way of living, she replied. There was no anger in her voice, only honesty. Ethan accepted those words with gratitude because he understood they were not an easy gift. As Vincent and Naomi walked toward the waiting vehicles, Ethan remained standing beneath the hotel lights, watching them disappear into the quiet rhythm of the city. In the weeks that followed, the video from the gala continued to inspire conversations across boardrooms, classrooms, churches, and family dinner tables throughout the country. People discussed leadership, humility, and the quiet strength of choosing dignity over revenge. Ethan introduced new leadership training throughout his company that emphasized respect for every employee regardless of position or title. Grace Turner received recognition for her integrity and compassion, reminding managers everywhere that character often reveals itself during uncomfortable moments rather than easy ones. Naomi completed her education while expanding the charitable work that had quietly shaped her life long before anyone knew her story. She chose to use the resources entrusted to her not to elevate herself above others, but to create scholarships for young people whose potential might otherwise remain unseen. Years later, many people remembered the gala because of the wealthy executives who attended, but those who were truly present remembered something entirely different. They remembered that the most powerful person in the room had not been the one with the largest fortune, the loudest voice, or the greatest influence. It had been the woman who answered humiliation with grace, accepted unexpected blessings with humility, and proved that real greatness is never measured by the way people treat those above them, but by the way they choose to honor those the world too often overlooks. Because money may open doors, influence may fill a room, and success may attract applause, but only respect leaves behind a legacy that time can never erase.